After a time, you pushed back the thick wool blanket and sat up slowly, your bare feet finding the packed earth floor. The hearth in the center of the room held a faint orange glow beneath a cap of grey ash, and you crossed to it with quiet steps, your shadow moving against the curved walls of turf and stone. You picked up a slender stick and stirred the embers carefully, a task you had performed so many times that your hands did it without thought, coaxing a small flame to life with the addition of dried moss and a few splinters of birch. The firelight stretched across the longhouse, picking out the grain of the heavy roof beams, the wooden loom near the door, the row of storage chests along the far wall, and the sleeping forms of the household still wrapped in blankets, their breathing a soft rhythmic chorus. Nobody stirred. The flame grew steady, and you set a pot of water at the edge of the hearth to warm. The morning routine had a familiar, comforting weight. You went to a small quernstone that sat on a low bench near the stores and measured out a handful of barley from a coarse sack, the grains running cool between your fingers before you poured them onto the grinding surface. The upper stone was smooth and rounded, worn by years of use, and you began to turn it with a slow, circular motion that required neither hurry nor great effort. The sound was a low, gritty rhythm, a hushing that blended with the small sounds of the fire. You turned a stone and listened, not to any particular thought, but to the simple music of the grind, the crunch of the barley breaking, the shift of the stone on its bed, the drip of water beginning to heat in the pot. Time moved gently here, in the circle of your hand as it always did before the day properly began. When the barley was ground into a coarse meal, you scraped it into a wooden bowl, the scent of the fresh flour rising faintly, nutty and dry. The water in the pot had begun to shiver with small bubbles, not yet a boil but warm enough, and you poured it over the meal a little at a time, stirring with a wooden spoon until the mixture thickened into a smooth, pale porridge. You added a pinch of salt from a small clay jar, and then you sat on a three-legged stool near the fire, the bowl warm in your hands, and ate slowly. The porridge was plain and filling, and you ate without distraction, watching the flames curl around a new piece of driftwood you had set on the fire. The wood popped once, softly, and a tiny shower of sparks drifted up towards the smoke hole before vanishing in the dark. By the time you finished eating, the quality of the light seeping through the narrow slits under the eaves had changed, shifting from deep grey to a softer pearly grey. That meant the mist outside was thinning, but the sun had not yet climbed above the hills. You set the bowl aside and pulled on a pair of thick wool socks and your leather boots, the leather cool and slightly damp from the night air. You lifted your heavy tunic from its peg and slipped it on, the wool settling around your shoulders with a familiar scratch and weight. Then you pushed open the low wooden door and stepped out into the morning. The air outside was perfectly still and full of moisture, a fine grey mist hanging in layers over the fjord and clinging to the lower slopes of the hills. The turf roof of the longhouse glistened with tiny beads of dew, and from the edge of the thatch a slow, irregular dripping sounded, water falling from the grass into the packed mud below with a soft, repetitive plink that merged with the general hush of the world. You stood just outside the door for a moment, feeling the cool air settle against your face and the dampness seep into the weave of your tunic. The farmyard was empty and quiet. The sheep shelter, a low extension of the main building, held the warm, earthy smell of animals still resting. The small storage hut, built of weathered planks and roofed with turf like the longhouse, sat a short distance away, its door shut and its walls dark with moisture. A few chickens moved in the shadows near the byre, their clucking so soft it was almost part of the silence. You walked across the yard, your boots making no sound on the damp grass, and stopped at a point where the land sloped gently down towards the water. The fjord lay before you, a long sheet of grey-silver water that was so still it looked almost solid, a polished surface that held the reflection of the hills in perfect, hazy reverse. The hills themselves rose in soft, rounded shapes, their lower reaches dark with pine and birch, while the upper slopes disappeared into a blanket of cloud. Nothing moved on the water, no boats, no birds, not even a ripple. The tide was halfway in or halfway out, you could not tell which, and the shore was a dark line of pebbles and seaweed exposed to the damp air. The smell of salt and wet stone reached you faintly, a clean, cold scent that seemed to hold all the quiet of the morning within it. You stood there for a long time, not thinking about anything in particular, simply letting your eyes travel across the familiar view. This was your home, this sheltered arm of the fjord with its steep sides and its deep water, a place where generations before you had built their farmsteads and fished the same waters. The fields behind the house were small but fertile, and the forest beyond them was full of timber and game. It was a good place, a quiet place, and it had always felt safe. But this morning, as you let your gaze drift further out towards the mouth of the fjord where the headlands open to the wider sea, something caught your attention. Far away, beyond the furthest point of land that you could see, a thin line of smoke rose against the grey sky. It was so distant that it was barely a smudge, a faint, vertical blur that might have been mist or a trick of the morning light. But you looked at it steadily, and you knew it was smoke, the kind that rises from a hearth fire, a cook fire, perhaps even a larger fire. It came from beyond the headland, from somewhere along the coast where other farms lay, other small settlements that you knew of but rarely visited. The smoke was perfectly still in the windless air, a narrow column that climbed straight up until it diffused into the general grey of the clouds. There was nothing threatening about it, nothing that spoke of urgency or danger. It was just a thin line of smoke, one of many that you might see on any given day from a neighbour's chimney. But this morning you noticed it, and you held it in your gaze for a while. You had heard rumours over the past weeks and months, carried by a trader who had stopped at the head of the fjord with his small boat and his news from the wider world. He had spoken, in a calm, matter-of-fact way, of strange ships seen further down the coast, ships that came without warning and whose crews took what they wanted before slipping away again. The rumours were not new. They were the sort of tales that passed from farm to farm in the summer months, stories of the sea and its uncertainties, no more alarming than talk of a bad harvest or an early winter. You had listened to the trader as you mended a net, nodded once or twice, and then gone back to your work. There had been no sense of immediate worry, and there was none now. But the smoke, this morning, was a small reminder that the world beyond the fjord was not always as still and settled as the water before you. You shifted your weight slightly, feeling the dampness of the grass soak into the leather of your boots, and you thought about the supplies stored in the sheds and the longhouse. The winter had been long but not harsh, and the summer had brought a good harvest of barley and rye. The drying racks had been full of cod and haddock for weeks, and the brine barrel was packed with herring. The animals were healthy, the haystack was tall, and the store of tools and iron was everything you needed for mending and building. It was a quiet kind of wealth, not something to boast about, but something that kept the household fed and warm through the dark months. As you stood looking at the distant smoke, you turned this thought over in your mind, slowly and without any sense of alarm. It occurred to you that it might be wise to move some of the most important things away from the steading, to put them in places that were not so obvious, not so easy to find if someone came looking. It was a simple, practical thought, the sort of precaution that any farmer might take before winter, or before a storm, or before any small uncertainty on the horizon. You did not feel afraid. The idea came to you as naturally as the thought of mending a fence or clearing a ditch. It was just another task, a way of caring for what was yours, and it fit neatly into the slow, patient rhythm of your days. You stood there for a few more moments, watching the line of smoke until it began to thin and fade, blending back into the grey of the clouds, as if it had never been there at all. Then you turned away from the water and walked back towards the longhouse, your mind already beginning to list the things you would need: the sacks of barley, the dried fish, the tools, the small box of valuables, some of the spare wool and linen. The list formed itself quietly in the back of your thoughts, not as a plan to be written or spoken aloud, but as a series of gentle reminders, each one nudging the next into place. Inside the longhouse, the fire had burned down a little, and you added another small piece of driftwood, watching the flames take hold before you went to the storage area near the loom. The sacks of grain were stacked neatly against the turf wall, their coarse cloth rough under your hand as you checked each one, feeling the weight and the firmness of the contents. You counted them silently, 8 sacks of barley, 6 of rye, 2 smaller bags of dried peas. You decided without any great mental effort that you would move 6 of the barley sacks and 4 of the rye, leaving just enough in the house for the immediate weeks ahead. The rest would be hidden somewhere further afield, tucked into the folds of the land where the forest grew thick and the ground was soft with moss. The thought felt solid and right, and you let it settle into the quiet part of your mind where all the day's work was stored. You checked the fish stalls next, but only in your mind, because you did not need to go down to the shore to know exactly how many fish hung from the rafters of the small drying hut. You knew the number as well as you knew the number of sheep in the flock, or the names of the stars that showed above the fjord on clear winter nights. There would be enough to fill a barrel and a basket, and you could hide those near the rocks below the tide line, where the bladderwrack grew thick and the driftwood piled up in natural shelters. The tools were another matter, heavier and more awkward to carry, but there was a place behind the sheep shelter where the earth was soft and easy to dig, and a stone slab would cover everything neatly. The box of valuables you could bury near the old rowan tree in the pasture, a spot that you had always thought of as a kind of marker, a natural signpost in the landscape, and the wool and linen could go into the barrel in the peat hollow, dry and safe under a layer of moss and turf. These thoughts came to you not as a hurried rush of ideas, but as a slow, steady procession, each one finding its place in the order of the day. You stood near the hearth, the warmth of the fire on your face, and you let the plan assemble itself piece by piece, like a patch of weaving that grows under patient hands. There was no need to rush. The morning was still early, and the mist, although thinning, still lay in soft bands across the fjord, muting all sounds and covering the world in a gentle hush. You could take your time, moving from one task to the next with the same slow care that you brought to every chore, whether it was feeding the animals or mending a tool or grinding barley on a stone. The day ahead stretched out before you, a long, open span of hours to be filled with quiet, methodical work. You poured yourself a cup of water from the bucket near the door, the water cold and tasting faintly of the peat it had filtered through, and you drank it slowly, looking out through the open doorway at the farmyard. The light was growing now, a pale, diffuse brightness that made the grass shine with silver droplets and turned the mist into a soft, glowing veil. Somewhere in the forest, a single bird began to call. A few notes repeated 3 times before falling silent again. The sound was so far away that it seemed to come from another world, and it only deepened the stillness around the longhouse. You put the cup down and walked to the toolshed to find the wooden sledge, the one with the worn runners that glided easily over wet grass and moss. It leaned against the wall, its rope harness coiled neatly over the top, and you checked the lashings and the condition of the wood, running your hand over the smooth grain. It would do perfectly for the first trip, carrying the sacks of grain along the old track through the alders to the hidden hollow you had in mind. As you pulled the sledge out into the yard, the sheep in the shelter lifted their heads and looked at you with their calm, horizontal eyes, their jaws working slowly on last night's cud. Their quiet presence was a comfort, a reminder that the farm was alive in its slow, steady way, and you paused to scratch the nearest ewe behind the ear before turning back to the grain shed. The door of the shed opened with a familiar creak, and the interior smelled of dry husks and old settled dust, a smell that you associated with the best part of the harvest season. The sacks sat waiting, their shapes soft and heavy in the dim light, and you bent to lift the first one, feeling the good solid weight of the barley against your shoulder. You carried it out into the grey morning and set it carefully on the sledge, then went back for another, and another, your movements unhurried and steady, each step part of the slow dance of preparation that had begun with a single line of distant smoke. The day had found its shape, and all that remained was to follow it, one quiet action after another, through the mist and the stillness and the calm waiting hills. The grain shed stood a short distance from the longhouse, its walls built of rough-hewn timber that had weathered over many seasons to a deep silver grey, the colour of old driftwood. The roof was thick turf, the same as the main house, and a fringe of grass hung over the edges, dripping slowly from the morning mist. You crossed the wet grass of the yard, your boots leaving dark prints that slowly filled with water, and you pulled open the heavy wooden door with a familiar tug that made the leather hinges creak in a low, tired voice. The interior was dim, the only light coming from the open door behind you and a few narrow gaps between the wall planks where the wood had shrunk over time. Dust motes floated in the pale shaft of light, drifting without hurry, and the air inside was still and cool, carrying the dry, earthy scent of stored grain and the faint tang of old wood smoke that had seeped in from the longhouse over the years. You stood for a moment just inside the doorway, letting your eyes adjust to the gloom. The shed was not large, just big enough to hold the winter stores and a few extra tools, but it felt spacious because of the high peak of the roof and the way the sacks were stacked neatly along the walls, leaving a clear path down the center. The floor was packed earth, swept clean and covered with a layer of dry rushes that crackled softly under your boots. Against the left wall, the barley sacks sat in a row of 8, each one a rounded, heavy shape that seemed to huddle against its neighbor. On the right side, the rye sacks stood 6 in a line, slightly smaller and paler in color. Further back, near the rear wall, were the 2 small bags of dried peas, a basket of beans, and a clay jar of salt sealed with a wooden lid. Everything was in its place, arranged with the quiet order that came from years of careful habit. You walked slowly along the row of barley sacks, your hand reaching out to touch the coarse fabric as you passed. The cloth was made of tightly woven hemp, rough against your palm, and it had darkened with age and use, stained here and there with the oils of the grain and the dust of the shed. Each sack was tied at the neck with a length of thin rope, the knot still tight and secure. You paused at the first sack and bent close, your nose nearly touching the fabric, and you breathed in. The smell was clean and dry, a faint nuttiness with no hint of mold or damp. You pressed your hand against the side, feeling the firm resistance of the grain packed tightly inside, and the sack gave slightly under your touch, a soft, dense weight that spoke of a good harvest well stored. You straightened up and moved to the next sack, repeating the same slow inspection, a touch to the cloth, a quiet breath to test for any sourness, a gentle press to confirm the grain was still dry. Each sack was sound, and each one held the same comforting weight, the same promise of porridge and flatbread through the cold months. You counted them again, though you knew the number by heart. 8 sacks of barley, and the 4 sacks of rye that you would also take. You decided that the 2 sacks closest to the wall, the ones that had been stored the longest, would be the ones you hid, along with 4 others from the middle of the row. The selection was not difficult. You simply chose the sacks that would be easiest to move without disturbing the rest of the stack. You tugged the first one free, its base scraping softly across the rushes, and you lifted it with both arms, cradling it against your chest. The weight was substantial, but manageable, and you carried it out through the open door into the pale morning light, setting it down carefully on the wooden sledge that waited in the yard. The sledge was a simple thing. 2 long runners of birch wood with cross planks nailed across them, and a rope harness at the front for pulling. The barley sack settled onto the planks with a soft thump, and you turned back to the shed for the next one. The second sack came out the same way, carried against your chest with your arms wrapped around its girth, and you placed it beside the first, nudging it so that the 2 sacks sat side by side, their shapes fitting together like 2 old companions. You went back in for the third, and then the fourth, each trip a slow, measured journey from the dim shed to the grey yard, your footsteps steady on the wet grass. By the time you had loaded the 6th barley sack, the sledge was beginning to look full, the sacks stacked in a low, neat pile that rose no higher than your waist. You paused to catch your breath, though you were not winded, and you looked out across the fjord. The mist was still there, but it had lifted a little, pulling back from the water to reveal a band of silver between the grey of the hills and the grey of the clouds. Nothing moved on the water, and the distant smoke was gone, lost in the soft, heavy air. The world was still and quiet, and you felt the calm of the morning settle into your bones as you stood there, your hands resting on the rough fabric of the sacks. You went back into the shed for the rye. The 4 sacks were lighter than the barley, the grains smaller and more compact, and you carried each one out with the same careful pace, adding them to the pile on the sledge. When all the sacks were loaded, you stepped back and looked at the sledge, checking that the load was balanced and secure. Then you fetched a length of hemp rope from the toolshed and passed it over the top of the stack, threading it through the gaps in the runners and pulling it tight with a series of slow, firm knots. The rope bit into the coarse cloth of the sacks, and you tested the tension by tugging on the load, making sure nothing would shift when you started to pull. The sledge was ready, and you stood for a moment with your hand on the rope, feeling the rough fibers against your skin. The morning had grown a little brighter, though the sun was still hidden behind the clouds, and the air was beginning to lose its early chill. You took hold of the rope harness and looped it over your shoulder, settling the wide strap across your chest so that the weight would pull evenly. Then you leaned forward, and the sledge began to move, the runners hissing softly over the wet grass. The sound was a smooth, continuous shush, the sort of sound that blended into the background of your thoughts, and you focused on the path ahead, your eyes picking out the familiar track that led away from the farmyard towards the alder wood. The ground rose gently at first, and the sledge came willingly, its weight a steady presence behind you that required no great effort to manage. You walked slowly, your feet finding the flattest parts of the path, and you let your breathing settle into a slow, even rhythm that matched the pull of the sledge and the soft crunch of your boots on the damp earth. The tracks through the alders was narrow and winding, just wide enough for the sledge to pass without scraping against the trunks. The trees grew close together here, their smooth grey bark marked with patches of pale lichen, and their leaves, still wet from the mist, made a soft papery rustle whenever a breath of air moved through the branches. The undergrowth was mostly ferns, their fronds drooping with moisture, and moss that covered every rock and fallen log in a thick green carpet. You followed the path as it curved around a large boulder and then dipped slightly, crossing a small boggy patch where the ground squelched under your boots and the sledge left deep grooves in the mud. You paused there for a moment, letting the sledge rest while you looked back at the farm. The longhouse was still visible through the trees, its turf roof blending with the hillside, and a thin wisp of smoke rose from the smoke hole, so faint it was almost invisible. The sight was reassuring, a small marker of home in the quiet landscape, and you turned back to the path, giving the rope a gentle tug to set the sledge moving again. The hollow you had chosen as the first hiding place lay a little further on, in a small clearing, where two large boulders stood side by side, their surfaces covered with moss and small ferns. A fallen birch tree lay across the gap between them, its trunk silver and smooth, and the whole space was half hidden by a thick curtain of bracken that grew tall around the edges. You had found the spot years ago while gathering firewood, and you had noted it then as a natural shelter, a place where things could be kept dry and out of sight. Now, as you pulled the sledge into the clearing, you saw that it was just as you remembered, the ferns still tall and green, the boulders still grey and solid, the fallen birch still in place. The ground inside the hollow was covered with a deep layer of dry moss, soft and springy underfoot, and the air smelled of damp earth and the faint sweetness of decaying leaves. You unlooped the rope from your shoulder and let the sledge come to a stop just outside the gap between the boulders. Then you began to unload the sacks, one by one, lifting them from the sledge and carrying them into the shelter of the hollow. The first sack you placed directly on the moss, settling it into a shallow depression so that it would not roll, and you covered it with a piece of old sailcloth that you had brought from the shed, a heavy, oiled canvas that smelled faintly of fish and salt. The second sack went beside the first, and you folded the sailcloth over both of them, tucking the edges under so that no part of the coarse hemp was visible. The third and fourth sacks followed, and then the rye sacks, each one placed carefully in the growing pile, and you layered more sailcloth over them, weighting the corners with small stones to keep everything in place. When all the sacks were stowed, you stepped back and looked at the hiding spot. The hollow was deep enough that the pile of sacks was completely hidden from any angle, and the ferns and the fallen birch formed a natural screen that blocked the view from the path. You knelt down and rearranged a few fronds of bracken, bending them forward so that they covered the entrance to the hollow even more completely, and then you stood up, brushing the moss and leaf litter from your tunic. The work had taken less time than you expected, and you stood for a while in the clearing, listening to the quiet of the wood. The mist had thinned to a soft haze, and the light filtering through the trees was a pale green-tinged gold that made the moss glow and the droplets of water on the ferns sparkle like tiny glass beads. A single bird sang somewhere high in the alders, a series of descending notes that repeated twice before stopping, and then the silence returned, deeper and more complete than before. You felt no urgency, no sense of hurry or worry. The sacks were safe, tucked away in their hidden bed of moss, and you had the rest of the day ahead of you to finish the other hiding places. You walked back to the sledge, which now stood empty in the clearing, its planks bare and wet from the grass, and you picked up the rope harness, coiling it neatly before slinging it over your shoulder. The sledge was light without its load, and you pulled it easily as you made your way back along the track through the alders, the runners sliding over the mud and moss with a soft, whispering sound that seemed to hush the world around you. By the time you reached the farmyard, the mist had lifted completely, and the fjord lay open and grey under the wide sky. The water was still perfectly calm, a flat expanse of silver that reflected the hills and the clouds with such clarity that it was hard to tell where the land ended and the reflection began. You left the sledge near the grain shed and went into the longhouse to warm your hands at the fire, adding a few more sticks of driftwood and watching the flames curl around them. The porridge pot was still on the hearth, and you ate a few spoonfuls of the cold remains, not because you were hungry, but because it was there and it was good to finish what had been started. Then you washed your hands in the water bucket and dried them on your tunic, feeling the grit of the grain dust wash away and the cool water refresh your skin. The morning had been slow and steady, and the first part of your quiet plan was done, folded into the landscape as neatly as the sacks were folded into their mossy bed. You stood by the fire for a little while longer, letting the warmth seep into your shoulders and your hands, and you thought about the fish that still waited by the shore, the tools that needed to be buried, the small box of amber and silver that sat beneath the sleeping bench. There was more to do, but there was no rush. The day was long, and the world was calm, and you would do each thing in its own time, with the same patient care that you had given to the barley and the rye. The sledge was loaded and ready, its wooden runners resting on the damp grass, the sacks of grain stacked in a neat, compact pile and bound with the hemp rope you had pulled tight and knotted with care. You stood beside it for a moment, your hand resting on the rough fabric of the nearest sack, and you looked out across the farmyard to the edge of the alder wood. The trees stood in a soft grey-green line at the boundary of the cleared land, their trunks slender and straight, their leaves barely moving in the still air. The mist had lifted enough that you could see the opening of the track, a darker gap in the undergrowth where the ferns were pushed aside and the ground was worn smooth by years of passing feet and dragged wood. The sight was familiar and reassuring, a pathway you had walked countless times, and you felt no urgency as you took up the rope harness and settled it across your shoulder. The first pull was always the hardest, the moment when the runners had to break their grip on the wet grass and begin to slide. You leaned forward, putting your weight into the movement, and the sledge gave a soft lurch before it started to glide, the birch runners hissing over the ground with a sound like water over stones. You found your rhythm quickly, a steady, unhurried pace that matched the slow beat of your heart, and you guided the sledge towards the trees, your boots leaving dark prints in the silvered grass. The morning light was still soft and diffuse, filtered through a high layer of cloud that turned the whole sky into a pale, even dome, and the air smelled of wet earth and the faint sweetness of the grass you crushed underfoot. As you entered the wood, the quality of the light changed, shifting from the open grey of the farmyard to a deeper, greener shade that seemed to wrap around you like a cool cloth. The alders grew close on either side, their bark a patchwork of grey and pale green where the lichen clung, and their leaves, round and slightly serrated, hung motionless in the damp air. The path was soft underfoot, a mixture of moss and old leaf mould that gave slightly with each step, and the sledge runners cut two smooth, shallow grooves in the surface, dark lines that filled slowly with water from the saturated ground. Overhead, the branches interlaced, forming a loose canopy that let through a shifting pattern of light. and now and then a single drop of collected mist would fall from a leaf and land with a tiny audible tap on the sledge or on your shoulder, a small surprise that felt almost friendly. You walked slowly, your eyes moving from the path ahead to the trees on either side, noting the familiar landmarks that marked the way. There was a large flat rock covered with a thick cushion of emerald moss, its surface soft as a pillow and always wet to the touch. There was a stand of birch that leaned together as if sharing a secret, their white bark peeling in thin papery curls that rustled faintly when the air stirred. A small stream crossed the path further on, so narrow you could step over it, its water brown with peat and moving so slowly it made no sound at all. These things were part of the walk, markers that you acknowledged without thought, the same way you acknowledged the turn of the seasons or the daily path of the dim sun behind the clouds. The sledge followed you willingly, its load steady and balanced, and you paused only once to adjust the rope on your shoulder, shifting it to a slightly different position where it would not chafe. During the pause, you listened to the quiet of the wood, a quiet that was not empty but full of small, gentle sounds, the distant drip of water from the leaves, the faint rustle of something small moving in the undergrowth, the soft creak of a branch settling somewhere out of sight. A raven called once from high in the hills, a deep croaking note that echoed for a moment and then faded, leaving the silence even deeper than before. You stood there with your hand on the sledge, breathing the cool, damp air, and you felt the peace of the morning settle over you like a second blanket, heavy and warm despite the chill. After a short while you resumed your walk, and the path began to rise slightly, climbing away from the flat ground near the fjord and leading you into a part of the wood where the trees grew thinner and the undergrowth became a tangle of ferns and low bushes. The ground here was rockier, and the sledge runners bumped gently over exposed roots and small stones, a soft, rhythmic thumping that you felt through the rope as much as you heard. You guided the sledge carefully around the larger obstacles, choosing the smoothest route without needing to think, your feet finding the way as if they knew it on their own. The ferns grew taller as you walked, their fronds unrolling from tight coils into broad, feathery shapes that brushed against your legs and left trails of moisture on the wool of your trousers. The smell of the wood changed here, becoming earthier, richer, with a hint of something sweet and decaying that spoke of mushrooms hidden under the leaf litter and old logs slowly returning to soil. The clearing with the boulders appeared gradually, first as a lightening of the trees ahead, then as a distinct open space ringed with the tall green wall of ferns. You slowed your pace as you approached, letting the sledge come to a gentle stop at the edge of the clearing, and you stood for a moment looking at the place. The two grey boulders were just as you remembered them, ancient and solid, their sides covered with patches of pale green lichen and small star-shaped mosses. The fallen birch still lay between them, its trunk smooth and silver, its bark peeling in a few places to show the darker wood beneath. The hollow between the boulders was deep and sheltered, its floor covered with a thick bed of moss, so dry and springy it looked like a woven mat. The whole space felt hidden and safe, a secret room made by the slow work of time and weather, and you felt a quiet satisfaction as you unlooped the rope from your shoulder and let the sledge rest. You began to unload the sacks one by one, lifting each with both arms and carrying it carefully into the hollow. The first sack you placed directly on the moss, settling it into a natural depression where it sat, as if it had always been there. You went back for the second and then the third, each trip a slow, measured movement that took you from the sledge to the boulders and back again, your boots pressing deep prints into the soft ground of the clearing. The barley sacks were heavy and firm, their rough fabric scratchy against your cheek as you balanced them against your chest, and the rye sacks were lighter, easier to carry, their contents shifting softly inside like a bag of small pebbles. You placed them side by side in the hollow, building a low, neat wall of grain that filled the space between the boulders from one side to the other. When all the sacks were arranged, you went back to the sledge and retrieved the pieces of old sailcloth that you had brought, the same heavy, oiled canvas that had once been part of a boat's sail, and still carried the faint, distant smell of salt and fish. You unfolded the cloth and laid it over the sacks, tucking the edges down around the sides so that every part of the coarse hemp was covered. The canvas was stiff and slightly sticky from the oil, and it made a soft rustling sound as you worked, a sound that seemed loud in the quiet of the clearing. You placed a few flat stones on the corners to hold the cloth in place, then stepped back to check that everything was secure. The pile of sacks was completely hidden, a dark, shapeless mound under the canvas, and the boulders rose on either side like protective walls. The final step was to pull the ferns back into place, restoring the natural screen that hid the hollow from view. You knelt at the edge of the clearing and took hold of the tall fronds, bending them carefully forward so that they leaned over the gap between the boulders. The ferns were heavy with moisture and flexible, and they stayed where you put them, creating a dense green curtain that blocked the hollow from sight. You worked slowly, moving along the edge of the clearing and adjusting each fern until the entrance was completely hidden, and when you were finished, you stood up and looked at the spot. There was nothing to see. No sign of the sacks, no hint of the hollow, just the two grey boulders and the fallen birch and the thick green wall of ferns that looked as if it had never been disturbed. You stayed in the clearing for a while, not because you needed to rest, but because the place invited stillness. The light filtering through the trees had a soft golden-green quality that made the moss glow and the drops of water on the ferns sparkle. You sat down on the fallen birch, feeling the smooth bark under your hands, and you listened to the sounds of the wood. A bird sang somewhere nearby, a short series of notes that rose and fell, and a light breeze moved through the alders, making the leaves tremble with a sound like distant rain. The air was cool and clean, and you breathed it in deeply, feeling it fill your chest, and then leave again in a slow, calm rhythm that matched the pulse of the forest. You thought about the grain, now safe in its hidden bed, and you felt a quiet sense of completion. The same feeling you had when a field was fully harvested or a net was mended and ready for the water. After a time, you rose from the birch trunk and walked back to the sledge, which stood empty at the edge of the clearing, its planks bare and wet from the grass. You took up the rope harness and turned the sledge around, pointing it back towards the farm, and you began the walk home. The return journey was easier, the sledge light and easy to pull, and you moved at the same slow pace, letting your eyes wander over the familiar trees and the soft, mossy ground. The tracks you had made on the way out were still visible, two dark lines in the wet soil, and you followed them without thought, your mind quiet and empty, resting in the gentle rhythm of walking. By the time you emerged from the trees and saw the longhouse and the grey water of the fjord beyond, the morning had passed into early afternoon, though the light was unchanged, still pale and diffuse under the blanket of cloud. You left the sledge near the grain shed and went to the water bucket to drink, the cold water tasting of peat and stone, and he felt the quiet satisfaction of a task done well, one more small step in the slow, careful work of hiding what mattered most. The grain was safe in its mossy hollow, tucked between the grey boulders and covered with sailcloth and ferns, and you had returned the empty sledge to its place near the tool shed. The morning had passed in slow, steady work, and now the pale light of midday lay over the farmyard, flat and unchanging under the high blanket of cloud. You stood near the longhouse door, drinking another cup of cold water from the bucket, and you let your gaze drift down the gentle slope towards the shore. The fjord lay beyond the grass and the rocks, a long sheet of grey-silver water that was so still it looked solid, and the small fish hut stood at the edge of the tide line, its stilts dark with moisture and its turf roof blending into the hillside behind it. You finished the water, set the cup aside, and began to walk down towards the shore, your boots making soft, wet sounds on the grass that grew shorter and sparser as you neared the pebbles. The fish hut was a modest structure, barely larger than a storage chest, built on 4 stout posts of birch wood that had been driven deep into the shingle. The walls were made of driftwood planks, their surfaces smoothed and silvered by salt and wind, and the roof was a thick layer of turf that had grown shaggy over the summer, the grass hanging over the edges in untidy clumps. A single door, low and narrow, faced the water, and a small wooden ladder, just 3 rungs, led up to it. The hut had no windows, but the gaps between the planks allowed a dim light to filter through and the air to circulate, keeping the fish dry and cool. You climbed the ladder slowly, feeling the wood flex slightly under your weight, and you pushed open the door with a hand that knew exactly where the latch was, an old piece of whalebone polished smooth by years of use. The smell inside was the first thing that greeted you, a rich, salty, smoky scent that filled the small space completely, a smell that had soaked into the wood and the turf and the very air so deeply that it seemed to be part of the hut's substance. It was not an unpleasant smell, but it was strong, the concentrated essence of many seasons of drying fish, and you breathed it in as you ducked through the low doorway and stood up inside. The interior was dim, the only light coming through the cracks between the planks in thin, pale lines that striped the walls and the hanging fish like the bars of a strange cage. You let your eyes adjust, and the shapes around you resolved into familiar forms, the rows of cod and haddock hanging from the rafters, the brine barrel standing in the corner, the stack of woven baskets waiting beside the door. The fish hung head down from lengths of thin rope strung between the beams, their bodies stiff and straight, their skin darkened to a deep amber brown from the months of smoking. There were cod, their heads removed and their bodies split open, the flesh firm and flaky under the dried skin, and there were haddock, smaller and darker, their tails tied together in pairs that hung like strange, silent wind chimes. You reached up and touched one of the cod, feeling the dry, slightly rough texture of the skin, the firmness of the flesh beneath. It was perfectly preserved, hard as wood in some places, but with a slight give that meant it would soften well in a pot of water. You lifted it gently, testing its weight, and the rope creaked softly as the fish swung a little before settling back into stillness. You had come to move the fish, or at least a good portion of them, to a hiding place further along the shore. The work would require several trips, and you began by fetching one of the woven baskets from the stack by the door. The basket was made of willow withies, light but strong, with a wide mouth and a carrying strap of twisted leather. You held it open and began to take down the fish, one by one, handling each with the same slow care you had given to the sacks of grain. The cod came first, their bodies long and heavy, and you laid them in the basket in a neat overlapping pattern, their tails pointing one way and their heads the other. The haddock followed, smaller and easier to pack, fitting into the gaps between the larger fish. You worked methodically, counting as you went, though the number was not important. You simply let the task fill your hands and your mind, the rhythm of reaching up, lifting down, and placing the fish into the basket becoming as steady and soothing as the motion of the quern stone earlier that morning. When the basket was full, you lifted it by the strap and carried it to the door, stepping carefully down the ladder to the shingle below. The pebbles shifted under your boots with a dry, clattering sound, and you walked along the shore, heading east towards a place you knew well. The shoreline here was a mixture of grey stone and dark rock, with patches of bladderwrack draped over the larger boulders like wet brown blankets. The tide was low and the rocks above the waterline were dry, their surfaces crusted with barnacles that crunched faintly under your feet. You walked slowly, picking your way along the uneven ground, the basket heavy on your shoulder, and you let your eyes rest on the calm water and the distant hills, the same view you had seen 1,000 times and never tired of. The hiding place was a cleft in the rocks, a narrow gap between two large slabs of granite that leaned together to form a natural shelter. The opening was hidden from the fjord by a thick growth of bladderwrack and a pile of driftwood that had collected there over many winters, bleached white and silver by the salt and sun. You set the basket down and pulled aside some of the seaweed, the wet fronds cold and slippery against your hands, and you peered into the cleft. The space inside was dry and surprisingly spacious, its floor covered with fine, pale sand that had blown in over the years. The rock walls rose on either side, curving inward to form a rough ceiling, and the air inside was cool and still, smelling faintly of salt and the iodine tang of the seaweed. You began to transfer the fish from the basket to the cleft, laying them on a bed of dry driftwood that you arranged on the sand. The cod went first, placed side by side with their tails towards the back of the cleft, and the haddock went on top, stacked in a crisscross pattern that allowed air to move between them. You worked carefully, making sure each fish was secure and would not slide, and when the basket was empty, you covered the pile with a piece of old sailcloth that you had brought from the hut, weighting the corners with smooth, round stones. Then you pulled the bladder rack back into place, draping it over the opening until the cleft was completely hidden. Just another shadow among the dark rocks. You made 3 more trips that afternoon, each one following the same slow, measured pattern, climbing the ladder to the hut, filling the basket with fish, carrying it along the shore to the cleft, and tucking the dried cod and haddock into their secret shelter under the rock. By the 3rd trip, your hands had taken on the smell of the smoked fish, a rich, oily scent that clung to your skin and reminded you of winters past, of stews simmering over the hearth and the warm, full feeling of a meal made from the sea's bounty. The work was repetitive but not tiring, a quiet, steady rhythm that left your mind free to wander, and you found yourself thinking about the barrel of brine that still waited in the corner of the hut, a task that would require a different kind of effort. The brine barrel stood in the darkest corner of the fish hut, a stout cask made of oak staves bound with iron hoops, its wood dark and stained from years of holding salted herring. It was heavier than the sacks of grain, heavier than the baskets of dried fish, and he knew that moving it would be a slower, more deliberate process. You had thought about rolling it along the shore, and the idea seemed sound. The ground was mostly level, and the pebbles, though loose, would not prevent the barrel from turning if you guided it carefully. You climbed into the hut one last time and stood looking at the barrel, your hands resting on its rough, damp surface. The wood was cool to the touch, slightly slippery with the brine that had seeped through over time, and when you pressed your ear close to the lid, you could hear the faint, wet shift of the herring inside, a soft sloshing sound that spoke of their preservation. You gripped the barrel by its upper rim and tilted it gently, feeling the weight of the brine and the fish shift inside. It was heavy, but manageable, and you began to rock it back and forth, working it free from the corner where it had sat for months. The barrel scraped against the wooden floor with a low, hollow sound, and you eased it towards the door, moving it an inch at a time. Getting it down the ladder was the trickiest part, and you took your time, lowering the barrel carefully from rung to rung, your arms braced and your movements slow. It landed on the shingle with a soft crunch, and you straightened up, breathing a little harder but not winded, and you looked along the shore towards the cleft where the dried fish were hidden. The barrel was too large to fit into the cleft, but there was another spot nearby, a shallow depression in the rocks just above the high tide line, sheltered by an overhang that would keep the rain off. You began to roll the barrel along the shore, guiding it with both hands, your palms flat against the rough staves. The barrel turned slowly, its iron hoops catching the grey light and gleaming dully, and it left a shallow track in the pebbles, a line that wound along the shore like the trail of some slow, heavy animal. You stopped every few yards to rest, not because you were tired, but because the work required patience, and you used the pauses to look out at the fjord, at the water that stretched away towards the sea, calm and empty and profoundly quiet. When you reached the overhang, you maneuvered the barrel into the depression, turning it so that the lid faced uphill and would not catch the rain. You wedged a few stones around the base to hold it steady, then stepped back to examine your work. The barrel sat snugly in its new home, half hidden by the overhang and the surrounding rocks, and you gathered a few armfuls of dried seaweed to drape over it, adding another layer of concealment. The seaweed was light and crinkly, its surface rough with salt, and it blended perfectly with the other rocks, making the barrel look like just another dark shape on the shore. You stood there for a while, your hands on your hips, and you felt the same quiet satisfaction you had felt in the forest clearing, the sense of something valuable put safely away. The walk back to the farm was slow and easy, your boots crunching on the pebbles and then softening on the grass as you climbed the slope. The light was beginning to change now, the grey of the sky taking on a slightly deeper tone that hinted at the approach of evening, though the sun was still invisible and the day was still long. You stopped at the water bucket to wash your hands, scrubbing them with a handful of coarse sand until the smell of fish faded to a faint, clean trace, and then you went into the longhouse to stir the fire. The embers glowed orange, and you added a few sticks and watched the flames catch, the small bright fire flickering in the dimness and casting moving shadows on the walls. You thought about the fish in the brine barrel, now hidden among the rocks, and you thought about the tools and the iron that still waited in the workshop lean-to, a task for the next part of the day, a task that could wait a little longer while you rested by the hearth and listened to the soft, distant hush of the fjord against the stones. The afternoon light lay across the farmyard with the same flat grey quality it had held all day, a diffuse brightness without shadow or blare that made every surface appear soft and slightly muted. You left the long house after tending the fire, the warmth of the hearth still lingering on your face and hands, and you walked towards the workshop lean-to that stood against the side of the sheep shelter. The lean-to was a simple structure, no more than a roof of rough planks supported by 3 upright posts, open on 2 sides to the yard and closed at the back by the turf wall of the shelter. It smelled of iron and old wood, of the faint metallic tang of rust and the earthier scent of the sheep that dozed on the other side of the wall, their presence a constant, gentle warmth. You stood inside the lean-to for a moment, your eyes adjusting to the deeper shade under the low roof. The tools were arranged with the same quiet order that governed the grain shed and the fish hut, each thing in its place on wooden pegs or resting on a low bench of split logs. The iron axe heads, 3 of them, hung from a peg by their eyes, their cutting edges dark with a thin coat of grease that protected them from damp. The spare scythe blade was wrapped in a piece of linen and propped in a corner, its long curve just visible through the cloth. 2 augers, their metal twisted into spirals, lay side by side on the bench, their wooden handles worn smooth by campless turns. A bundle of iron nails, each one forged by hand and slightly different from its neighbor, sat in a clay pot filled with greased wool to keep them from rusting, and beside them rested the small anvil, a block of solid iron no larger than a loaf of bread, its top surface polished bright from use, but its sides dark and pitted. These were precious things, difficult to replace in a world where iron came rarely and at great cost, and you regarded them with the same calm, appraising attention you had given the grain and the fish. You gathered the items one by one, moving slowly and without hurry, lifting each from its resting place and setting it on the bench. The axe heads were heavy and dense, their weight out of proportion to their size, and they made a solid, satisfying clunk when you placed them down. The scythe blade was longer and more awkward, its thin metal flexing slightly as you carried it. The augers clicked softly against each other when you set them down, and the pot of nails rattled with a tiny metallic sound like a handful of small pebbles. The anvil was the heaviest of all, and you lifted it with both hands, feeling the strain in your arms as you transferred it to the bench, its cold surface gritty under your fingers. You looked at the collection for a while, making sure you had not forgotten anything. A spare hammerhead, a pair of tongs, a small chisel that you sometimes used for woodworking. You added these to the pile, and then you went to a shelf at the back of the lean-to where you kept the wrapping materials. The shelf held a stack of oiled leather squares, their surfaces dark and supple with the residue of rendered fat, and a pile of linen scraps that had been washed and dried many times until they were soft as old cloth can be. There was also a coil of thin cord, twisted from flax fibers, strong and smooth, and a few lengths of woolen yarn for lighter ties. You took a leather square and laid it flat on the bench, its surface cool and slightly tacky, and you placed one of the axe heads in the center, folding the leather over it with the same care you would use to wrap a piece of bread. The leather covered the iron completely, and you tied it in place with a length of cord, wrapping the cord around twice and knotting it with a simple loop that would hold fast. You set the wrapped axe head aside and reached for the next, repeating the motion, your hands working with the slow, automatic precision that came from years of mending nets and sewing sails and doing all the small, careful tasks of a farm. The scythe blade required a longer piece of linen, which you wound around the metal in a spiral, covering the sharp edge and the tang, and you tied it in 3 places, the knots tight and even. The augers you wrapped together in a single leather bundle, their spiral bits pointing in opposite directions so they would not catch on each other, and the nails you left in their pot, simply stuffing a piece of greased wool into the top to seal them in. The small anvil you wrapped last, using a double layer of linen and securing it with cord until it looked like a lumpy, unremarkable package that gave no hint of its contents. When everything was wrapped, you gathered the bundles into a basket, the same woven willow basket you had used for the fish earlier, and you carried it out of the lean-to and around the corner to the back of the sheep shelter. The sheepyard here was a small enclosed space, its ground packed hard by the daily passage of hooves and padded with a layer of old straw and droppings that had been trodden into a dense, earthy mat. The sheep themselves were inside the shelter, visible through the gaps in the turf wall, their bodies warm and woolly and their breath making soft, moist sounds in the dimness. They turned their heads to look at you as you approached, their horizontal eyes calm and incurious, and then they went back to chewing, their jaws moving in slow, steady circles that seemed to mark the rhythm of the afternoon itself. You set the basket down and chose a spot near the back wall, a patch of earth that was slightly raised and covered with a thin layer of straw. The ground here was not packed as hard as the rest of the yard, and you knelt down, pressing your hand against the soil to test its give. It was soft and crumbly, dark with moisture and full of small roots from the grass that grew along the edge of the shelter, and it would be easy to dig. You fetched a digging stick from the lean-to, a stout piece of ashwood with one end sharpened to a blunt point and the other end worn smooth by many hands, and you began to work the earth. The stick went in easily, the soil parting with a soft gritty sound, and you loosened it in small sections, piling the dirt to one side in a neat mound. You dug slowly, not because the work was hard, but because there was no need to rush, and you paused often to clear away stones and roots, tossing them aside with a flick of your wrist. The trench you made was shallow, no deeper than the length of your forearm, and about as wide as the basket was long. You worked with a steady rhythm, the stick pushing into the earth and lifting it out, the soil crumbling over your hands and collecting under your fingernails, and the sound of the digging was a soft, repetitive shush that blended with the gentle rustle of the sheep in their shelter and the distant, quiet lap of the fjord against the shore. When the trench was finished, you stood up and stretched your back, looking at the neat rectangle of dark earth and the pile of soil beside it, and you felt the pleasant ache of work in your shoulders and your arms. The next step was to line the trench with flat stones, which you gathered from a small pile at the edge of the sheepyard, where you had stacked them years ago after clearing a field. The stones were of various sizes, grey and smooth, their surfaces cool and slightly damp, and you carried them over in small armloads, placing them carefully in the bottom of the trench and along the sides. You fitted them together like pieces of a simple puzzle, choosing stones that lay flat and would not wobble, and you filled the gaps with smaller chips and a handful of dry sand that you scooped from a corner of the yard. The stone lining was not elaborate, just a practical barrier against the damp and the probing roots of weeds, and it gave the trench a tidy, finished look that pleased you in a quiet, unspoken way. With the trench prepared, you lifted the rat tools from the basket and began to place them inside. The axe heads went first, their leather bundles heavy and firm, and you laid them side by side at the bottom of the trench, their shapes fitting neatly against the stone. The scythe blade went next, its long wrapped form requiring you to place it diagonally, and the augers and the pot of nails and the small anvil filled the remaining space, each bundle settling into the earth with a soft, final thump. You arranged them so that nothing pressed too hard against anything else, leaving a little space for the soil to settle, and then you covered the whole arrangement with a wooden plank that you had fetched from the lean-to, a piece of driftwood that was smooth and flat and just the right size. The plank rested on the stones, spanning the trench like a small bridge, and it would protect the tools from the weight of the earth above and from any probing animals. You began to fill the trench, scooping the soil back with your hands and the digging stick, working it into the gaps around the plank and over the top until the hole was completely filled. You patted the earth down with the flat of your hand, then with your foot pressing it firmly so that it would not sink or wash away in the rain. The surface was now a little higher than the surrounding ground, a slight mound of fresh, dark soil that would soon settle and blend in, and you took a handful of straw from the yard and scattered it over the top, mixing it with the dirt so that it looked like the rest of the sheepyard. You then fetched a pine branch from a pile of trimmings near the woodstack, and you used it to brush the area sweeping away the footprints and the marks of the digging stick, smoothing the edges of the mound until there was no clear sign that the earth had been disturbed. You worked carefully, moving slowly around the spot, brushing and scattering, and after a while the place looked exactly as it had before, just another patch of the sheepyard with its layer of straw and its smell of animals and earth. The sheep had watched the whole process from the shelter, their heads occasionally lifting when you made a louder sound, but mostly they just chewed and rested, their presence a calm, steady background to your work. One of the ewes, a large grey-faced animal with a thick fleece, ambled out of the shelter and stood near you, her breath warm and smelling of grass, and you reached out and scratched the wool between her ears, feeling the coarse, oily texture and the warmth of her skin beneath. She blinked slowly and then wandered away, her hooves making soft, padding sounds on the packed earth, and you were left alone with the quiet yard and the grey sky and the knowledge that the tools were safe. You sat down on a large, flat stone at the edge of the yard, the same stone where you often sat to mend harnesses or sharpen blades, and you let your hands rest on your knees. The afternoon had grown no brighter and no darker, the light still, that same pale, even grey that seemed to hold the day in suspension, and the air was cool and still, with no wind and no movement except the slow drift of the clouds high above. The fjord was visible through a gap in the buildings, a strip of silver water that lay flat and calm, and the hills beyond were soft grey-green shapes that faded into the haze. You listened to the sounds of the farm, the quiet, rhythmic chewing of the sheep, the faint rustle of the chickens scratching in the yard, the distant murmur of a stream that ran somewhere in the woods. The sounds were so familiar that you did not notice them as sounds at all. They were simply part of the quiet, woven into the fabric of the afternoon, like the grey light and the cool air. You thought about the tools, now buried in their stone-lined trench under the wooden plank, and you pictured them in your mind. The axe heads that had shaped so many beams and planks, the scythe blade that had cut the summer grass, the augers that had bored holes for pegs and dowels, the nails that had held everything together, the little anvil that had rung with the sound of hammering on long winter evenings. They were safe now, hidden from any eyes that might wander across the farm, and the thought brought a quiet, settled feeling, a sense of something completed. You did not dwell on any danger or fear. Those things had no place in this calm, slow day. You simply acknowledged that the work was done, and you let the thought go, returning your attention to the present moment, to the feel of the stone under you, and the cool air on your face, and the soft, steady presence of the sheep in their shelter. After a while, you rose from the stone and walked back to the lean-to, where you put away the remaining wrapping materials and straightened the tools that were left hanging on the pegs. The space looked bare now, with the axe heads and the augers and the anvil gone, but it was a bareness that felt orderly rather than empty, a sign that you had been careful and thorough. You gathered the digging stick and the pine branch and returned them to their places, and then you washed your hands again in the water bucket, scrubbing away the soil and the tiny flecks of iron that had stuck to your skin. The water was cool and clean, and you drank another cup, feeling it travel down your throat and settle in your stomach. A small, simple refreshment that matched the simplicity of the day. The afternoon was still long, and there was more to do, but you allowed yourself a moment of stillness, standing by the long-house door and looking out at the farm. The turf roofs glistened with the last of the morning dew, the grass in the yard was green and soft, and the fjord lay beyond it all, a quiet grey presence that held the whole valley in its calm. The small strong box with its amber beads and silver still waited under the sleeping bench, and the hay for the animals still needed to be moved, and the wool and linen still lay folded in the chest. But for now you stood and looked, and you felt the slow, deep peace of a day that asked nothing more of you than the careful, boring work of hiding what mattered. The longhouse was quiet and dim, the fire burning low in the hearth with a steady orange glow that cast long shadows across the packed earth floor. You had washed the soil from your hands and drunk another cup of water, and now you stood just inside the doorway, letting your eyes adjust to the interior after the pale grey light of the yard. The air inside was warm and still, smelling of wood smoke and dried herbs and the faint, clean scent of the wool blankets folded on the sleeping benches. The household was still about its own quiet tasks elsewhere on the farm, and you had the longhouse to yourself, a rare and peaceful solitude that felt appropriate for the task you had in mind. You walked across the room to the sleeping bench that was yours, a wide platform of planks built against the curved turf wall and covered with a thick mattress of straw sewn into a linen case. A wool blanket, dyed a soft brown with walnut husks, lay folded at the foot, and a small pillow stuffed with goose feathers rested at the head. Beneath the bench, in the shadowed space between the planks and the floor, was a small pine box that had sat there for as long as you could remember. You knelt down and reached under the bench, your fingers finding the familiar edges of the box, and you pulled it out into the firelight. The box was not large, about the length of your forearm and half as wide, made of pine boards that had been smoothed and joined with wooden pegs. The lid was fitted with two small iron hinges, simple and sturdy, and a clasp of carved bone held it shut. The wood had darkened with age to a deep honey color, and it was smooth to the touch from years of being handled. You set the box on the bench beside you and sat down, the straw mattress rustling softly under your weight, and you opened the lid with a quiet click of the bone clasp. Inside, the box held the things that mattered beyond the daily needs of food and tools and shelter, the small treasures that had been saved over years and passed down from those who had lived on this farm before you. There was a handful of hack silver, pieces of cut coins and twisted wire and small ingots that could be used for trade if the need ever arose. The silver was dull grey, unpolished, and it clinked softly when you moved it with your fingers, a quiet, metallic sound that seemed too small to echo. There were two twisted arm rings made of bronze that had darkened to a rich greenish brown, their surfaces marked with faint patterns of lines and dots that spiraled around the metal. The arm rings were heavy and solid, meant to be worn on a man's upper arm, and they had been made by a smith whose name you did not know, in a time before your own memory began. There was a small collection of amber beads, 6 of them, each one a slightly different shade of honey or gold or deep orange, their surfaces worn smooth by handling and warm to the touch, as amber always is. When you held one up to the firelight, it glowed from within, a tiny captured sun. And there was a bronze brooch, shaped like a bird with its wings half spread and its head turned to one side, the pin on the back still sharp and the catch still firm. The brooch had a face that seemed to look at you with a calm, ancient expression, and you turned it over in your hand, feeling the weight of the metal and the delicacy of the work. You looked at each item in turn, not with any sense of greed or worry, but with the same quiet appreciation you might give to a well-made tool or a particularly fine piece of grain. These things were valuable, not because they were money, but because they represented connections to the past and security for the future, and they deserved the same care you had given the sacks of barley and the racked iron tools. You set them out on the blanket beside the box, arranging them in a neat row, and then you reached under the bench again and retrieved a small leather pouch that you kept there for just such a purpose. The pouch was made of soft, oiled leather, its drawstring a thin strip of braided sinew, and it was large enough to hold all the items comfortably. You placed the hack silver in first, the pieces settling into the bottom of the pouch with a muffled clink, and then you added the arm rings, one after the other, their curved shapes fitting against the silver. The amber beads went in next, and you counted them as you dropped them in, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, each one a small warm weight that rolled against your palm. The bird brooch was the last item, and you wrapped it in a scrap of linen before placing it carefully on top, so that the pin would not catch on the leather or the other objects. Then you pulled the drawstring tight and tied it with a simple knot, and you held the pouch in your hand, feeling the pleasant, compact weight of it. The next step was to find a container that would protect the pouch from damp and dirt while it lay in the ground. You knew just the thing, a pottery jar with a fitted lid that sat on a shelf near the loom, used for storing small amounts of oil or honey, but currently empty. You fetched the jar and brought it back to the bench, examining it in the firelight. It was a simple vessel made of fired clay that had been tempered with crushed shell, its surface a warm reddish-brown and its shape a rounded cylinder with a narrow neck. The lid was a flat disc of the same clay, fitted with a small knob on top for lifting, and it sat snugly in the neck, forming a seal that would keep out most moisture and any curious insects. You wiped the inside of the jar with a dry cloth to make sure it was clean, and then you placed the leather pouch inside, lowering it gently until it rested at the bottom. The lid went on with a soft, gritty scrape, and you pressed it down firmly, feeling it settle into place. With the jar sealed, you carried it outside into the grey afternoon and walked towards the cow pasture, which lay on the far side of the farmyard, beyond the sheep shelter and the small midden heap. The pasture was a wide open space of rough grass and clover, bordered on one side by a low stone wall and on the other by the edge of the forest. The cows were there, 3 of them, large and brown and slow, their heads bent to the grass and their tails switching lazily against their flanks. They paid you no attention as you walked among them, your boots sinking slightly into the soft turf, and you made your way towards a particular spot near the center of the pasture where an old rowan tree grew beside a large flat stone. The rowan was a tree you knew well, its smooth grey bark marked with horizontal lines of lenticels, its branches spreading wide and its leaves divided into many small serrated leaflets that turned golden red in the autumn. Now in the late summer, the leaves were a deep dark green, and clusters of small hard berries were beginning to form among them, still green, but promising a bright orange by the season's end. The tree had stood in the pasture for longer than anyone remembered, and it had a presence that felt both protective and patient, a quiet guardian of the field and the animals that grazed around it. The flat stone beside it was a natural slab of granite, its surface worn smooth by rain and wind, large enough that it took 2 men to move it, though you had levered it up once before with the help of a stout wooden stake. You set the pottery jar down in the grass and walked back to the tool shed to fetch the stake, a length of ash wood about as tall as your shoulder and as thick as your wrist, with one end sharpened to a blunt wedge. You carried it back to the pasture and knelt beside the flat stone, studying its edges for the best place to insert the stake. The stone was set firmly into the earth, its base sunk a few inches into the soil by the weight of years, and you chose a spot where the ground was slightly softer, near a corner where the stone met the roots of the rowan. You pushed the wedge end of the stake under the edge and leaned your weight onto it, using the leverage to lift the stone a little at a time. The stone shifted with a low, grinding sound, the soil around it cracking and crumbling, and you worked the stake deeper, rocking it back and forth until the stone rose enough that you could get your fingers underneath. You lifted the stone carefully, your arms straining with the weight, and you propped it open with a smaller rock that you found nearby, creating a gap just large enough to work in. The space beneath the stone was dark and cool, the earth bare and compacted, smelling of minerals and old roots. You took the digging stick, the same one you had used behind the sheep shelter, and you began to scoop out a hollow in the exposed soil, working slowly and carefully so that you would not disturb the rowan's roots or undermine the stone's resting place. The earth here was denser than it had been in the sheepyard, more clay than loam, and it came away in firm, dark chunks that you piled to one side. You dug down about the depth of your hand, then widened the hollow until it was just large enough to hold the pottery jar. When the hollow was ready, you lifted the jar from the grass and lowered it into the hole, turning it so that the lid faced upwards and would not shift. The jar sat snugly in the earth, its rounded sides fitting the hollow as if the hole had been made for it, and you took a moment to look at it there, a simple clay vessel holding a leather pouch full of silver and bronze and amber, resting in the dark soil under the roots of the rowan tree. Then you began to fill the hole, pushing the soil back around the jar and tamping it down with your fingers, then with the flat of your hand, until the earth was firm and level with the surrounding ground. You removed the prop stone and lowered the flat stone back into place, easing it down carefully so that it would not crack or shift. The stone settled with a deep, solid thud, and you pulled the stake free and set it aside. The ground around the stone was disturbed, showing the marks of your work, and you spent a little while smoothing the soil with your hands, filling in the cracks and brushing away the loose dirt. You gathered a handful of fallen rowan leaves from beneath the tree, leaves that had dropped early for no reason you could name, and you scattered them over the stone and the surrounding earth, letting them fall in a natural pattern that looked as if the wind had put them there. The cows had wandered closer during your work, and one of them stood a few paces away, chewing slowly and watching you with her large, liquid eyes. Her breath was warm and sweet, smelling of clover, and she blinked once, slowly, before lowering her head to the grass again. You stood up and brushed the soil from your knees and hands, looking at the rowan tree and the flat stone. Nothing marked the place as special. Nothing suggested that anything lay beneath the grey granite slab except the earth itself and the roots of the tree. The stone looked as it had always looked, a familiar landmark in the pasture, and the rowan spread its branches overhead, its leaves moving only slightly in the still air. You felt the same quiet satisfaction you had felt at the boulder cache and the rock cleft and the sheepyard trench, a sense of things being where they belonged, safe and hidden and at peace. You picked up the digging stick and the stake and carried them back to their places, then washed your hands of the water bucket, for what felt like the third or fourth time that day, the ritual of cleaning becoming as familiar as the work itself. The sky was still grey and unchanging, the light still pale and even, and the afternoon stretched on without any sign of ending. You went back into the longhouse and sat on the bench near the fire, your hands resting on your knees, and you let the warmth of the flames wash over you while you thought about what remained. The hay for the animals still needed to be moved to the meadow stack, the wool and linen still waited in the storage chest, and there would be time enough for all of it. For now, you sat and listened to the fire crackle softly and the distant rhythmic sound of the cows pulling at the grass, a sound so quiet and constant that it was almost like breathing. The haystack behind the barn was tall and fragrant, a monument to the summer's long days of cutting and turning and raking under the pale northern sun. It stood against the back wall of the barn, a structure of dried grass and clover and timothy, its sides packed firm and its top rounded like the back of a sleeping animal. The smell that rose from it was sweet and clean, the concentrated essence of 100 windless afternoons, and when you walked past it in the normal course of the day, you could not help but breathe a little deeper, letting the scent fill your lungs and settle there like a memory of warmth. Now, in the grey, flat light of the afternoon, you stood beside it with the long-handled pitchfork in your hand, considering how much to move and where to take it. The animals had grazed well all summer, and their winter supply of hay was more than sufficient for the 3 cows and the small flock of sheep. But you had decided in the same quiet way you had decided to hide the grain and the fish and the tools, that it would be wise to move a portion of the fodder to a secondary stack further away, a place hidden by a rocky outcrop in a meadow that you seldom visited except in late autumn. The decision was not driven by any immediate worry, but by the same patient, careful instinct that made a farmer clear his ditches before the rains came and mend his fences before the snow fell. You ran your hand over the side of the haystack, feeling the springy resistance of the packed grass, and you chose a section near the eastern end where the hay was particularly sweet-smelling, a mix of red clover and meadow fescue that had been cut at just the right time. The pitchfork was an old tool, its ash handle worn smooth by many seasons of use, its 2 tines slightly curved and polished bright at the tips. You pushed the tines into the haystack with a gentle, steady pressure, feeling them slide through the layers of dried grass, and you lifted a forkful of hay, the load light and airy, the stems rustling like dry paper. You turned and carried the forkful to the wooden sledge, which you had positioned nearby, and you laid the hay onto the planks with a soft, crinkling sound, spreading it evenly so that it would build into a stable load. The sledge was the same one you had used for the grain sacks, its runners still muddy from the trip through the alders, and you had attached a few extra planks to the sides to hold the bulkier load of hay. You worked slowly, moving from the haystack to the sledge and back again, each forkful a small, light burden that required no great effort. The rhythm of the work was gentle, the push of the tines into the hay, the lift and turn, the walk across the few yards of grass, the placement of the hay on the growing pile. The afternoon air was still, and the hay made a constant, quiet rustling, a sound that was almost like the whisper of a distant stream. You paused now and then to press the load down with your hands, compacting the hay so that it would not spill during the walk, and you added more forkfuls, building the pile higher until it rose above your waist and then above your shoulders, a soft, fragrant mound that swayed slightly when you touched it. When the sledge was loaded, you fetched a coil of rope from the tool shed, a long length of hemp that was thick and strong, and you began to bind the hay down. You passed the rope over the top of the load, around the runners, and back again, working in a crisscross pattern that held the hay firmly in place. The rope bit into the dried grass with a soft, crackling sound, and you pulled each length tight before knotting it securely at the side of the sledge. You tested the binding by pushing against the load from different angles, and the hay compressed slightly but did not shift, a sign that it was well secured. The sledge was ready, and you took up the rope harness, settling it over your shoulder with the same familiar motion you had used earlier in the day. The walk to the remote meadow was longer than the trip to the boulder cache, but the way was level and the ground was good. You pulled the sledge away from the barn and across the farmyard, the runners hissing over the grass, and you headed towards the open ground that lay beyond the cow pasture, a stretch of heather and low bushes that led gradually towards the hills. The heather was in full bloom, its tiny bell-shaped flowers a deep purple that looked almost brown in the grey light, and the plants grew close together, forming a dense, springy carpet that released a faint, honey-like scent when the sledge runners crushed over it. You walked with a steady, unhurried pace, your boots pressing into the heather and then springing back, and you watched the landscape change around you as you moved further from the farm. The heather gave way to a patch of rough grass dotted with yellow hawkweed and small white yarrow flowers, and the ground became slightly softer, the soil darker and richer. A small marsh lay ahead, a shallow depression where the water table rose close to the surface and the grass grew in thick, bright green tussocks. You knew the marsh well, and you guided the sledge along its edge, where the ground was firm enough to support the weight without bogging down. A few reeds grew in the wettest part, their brown, cigar-shaped heads nodding gently even though there was no wind, and a dragonfly with a bright blue body hovered for a moment over a small pool before darting away. The marsh smelled of wet earth and a faint, vegetative sweetness, and the only sound was the soft, sucking noise of your boots in the damp ground and the distant, rhythmic call of a cuckoo somewhere in the hills. Beyond the marsh, the land rose slightly, and you came to the meadow where the hidden stack would be. The meadow was a small, bowl-shaped clearing in the landscape, surrounded on three sides by low, rocky ridges that were covered with grey lichen and tufts of coarse grass. A single large outcrop of dark granite stood at the far end, its surface weathered and cracked, and a few wind-stunted birches grew from the crevices, their leaves a pale, shivering green. The outcrop created a natural shelter, a protected area on its leeward side where the rain rarely reached and the wind was broken, and it was here that you planned to build the fodder stack. You pulled the sledge to a stop near the base of the outcrop and unlooped the harness from your shoulder, your breathing slightly deeper from the walk but still calm and even. You stood for a moment, looking around the meadow, listening to the quiet. The place was very still, more still than the farmyard, because here there were no animals and no sounds of the household, just the gentle sigh of the air moving through the birch leaves and the low, distant hum of bees working the heather. The ground beneath the outcrop was dry and flat, covered with a layer of old grey grass and a few scattered stones, and it was an ideal spot for a stack of hay. You untied the ropes from the sledge, coiling them neatly and setting them aside, and you began to unload the hay. You used the pitchfork to lift the forkfuls from the sledge and carry them to the sheltered spot under the outcrop, where you started to build the new stack. The hay was warm and fragrant, its scent intensified by being compressed on the sledge, and you handled it with care, laying it down in layers and pressing it gently with your hands to form a compact, stable shape. The stack rose slowly, a neat, rectangular pile that you built with the same attention you would give to a stone wall or a patch of thatching, making sure that each layer was level and that the edges were straight. The work was quiet and repetitive, the pitchfork rising and falling, the hay rustling, your boots shifting on the dry ground, and your mind drifted into the rhythm of the task, a calm, empty state where there was only the hay and the stack and the grey light of the afternoon. When all the hay from the sledge had been transferred, the stack stood about as tall as your shoulder and about twice as wide, a solid, dense block of dried grass and clover that would provide many weeks of feed for the animals. You walked around it, checking that it was stable and that no loose hay was hanging from the sides, and then you began the task of covering it. You had brought a roll of birch bark with you on the sledge, large sheets of the papery, silver-white bark that you had peeled from fallen trees in the forest earlier in the summer and stored in the barn. The bark was lightweight but waterproof, and you laid the sheets over the top of the stack, overlapping them like shingles so that any rain would run off and not soak into the hay. You weighted the bark down with stones that you gathered from the base of the outcrop, placing them carefully along the edges, and then you added a layer of cut branches, spruce and pine boughs that you had also brought on the sledge, their needles still green and smelling sharply of resin. The branches formed a rough, protective thatch over the bark, and you interwove them so that they would not blow away in any wind that might come. The stack was now well hidden and well protected, tucked under the dark curve of the granite outcrop, its covering of bark and branches blending with the natural debris of the meadow. You stood back and looked at it, and the satisfaction you felt was the same quiet, settled feeling that had accompanied each of the other hiding places: the boulder cache, the rock cleft, the sheepyard trench, the rowan tree stone. The animals would have their food, and no one wandering through the meadow would see anything but the outcrop and the birches and the scattered stones. You gathered the ropes and the pitchfork and loaded them onto the now empty sledge, and you began the walk back to the farm. The return journey was even slower than the outward one, because you were not in any hurry and because the afternoon light, still grey and unchanging, gave no sign of passing. You followed the same path along the edge of the marsh, where the reeds still nodded and the blue dragonfly still patrolled its small pool, and then across the heather, where the purple flowers glowed softly in the diffuse light and the honey scent rose around you. The sledge was light behind you, and you pulled it with one hand, letting your eyes wander over the wide, open landscape, the hills folding into one another, the distant water of the fjord, just visible as a thin silver line between the slopes. When you reached the shore near the fish hut, you paused. The tide was still low, and the rocks along the water's edge were covered with a thick growth of seaweed, dark brown and olive green, their fronds glistening with moisture. You remembered that the animals would benefit from a supplement to their winter feed, a basket of dried seaweed that could be mixed with the hay to provide salt and minerals, and you decided to collect some now while you were here and while the afternoon was still long. You left the sledge at the top of the shingle and fetched a basket from the fish hut, the same woven willow basket you had used earlier, and you walked down to the water's edge. The seaweed grew in abundance along the rocks, long strands of bladderwrack with their paired air bladders, and broad, crinkled sheets of sugar kelp that was slippery underfoot. You bent and gathered the seaweed with both hands, pulling it from the rocks with a gentle tug that released the holdfasts with a soft, wet pop. The seaweed was cool and slick, and it smelled of the sea, a sharp, clean, iodine scent that was entirely different from the sweet smell of the hay. You filled the basket slowly, choosing only the freshest and cleanest fronds, and you carried the basket back to the sledge, setting it carefully on the planks. You walked further along the shore to the overhang where the brine barrel and the dried fish were hidden, and you found the spot where you had placed the dried seaweed earlier. The overhang created a natural shelter, a deep recess under a projecting ledge of rock where the rains seldom reached, and the ground there was dry and sandy. You decided to leave the basket of fresh seaweed here, beside the other supplies, so that it would dry in the sheltered air and be ready for use in the winter. You placed the basket under the overhang, tucking it into a corner where it would not be disturbed, and you covered it loosely with a piece of old sailcloth to keep off any wind-blown moisture. The afternoon was beginning to feel longer now, the light taking on a slight deepening that was almost imperceptible, the first faint hint that evening was somewhere far off, still hours away but slowly approaching. You walked back to the sledge and pulled it up the slope to the farmyard, the runners scraping over the pebbles and then hushing on the grass. You returned the sledge to its place near the tool shed, the pitchfork to its peg, the ropes to their hook, and you washed your hands at the water bucket, scrubbing away the salt and the tiny fragments of seaweed that had stuck to your palms. The water was cool and refreshing, and you drank a cup slowly, looking out at the fjord and the hills and the grey, quiet sky. You thought about the haystack under the outcrop, the sweet clover and fescue packed tight and covered with bark and branches, and you thought about the basket of seaweed drying under the overhang, and you felt the deep, quiet satisfaction of a day that had been filled with simple, careful work. The animals would be fed, and the winter, when it came, would be a little easier for all the preparation. You sat down on the bench near the longhouse door, your hands resting on your knees, and you let the stillness of the farm wash over you, the soft sounds of the chickens and the sheep and the distant cows blending into a single peaceful hum that was the music of a quiet life. The storage chest in the longhouse sat against the curved turf wall near the loom, a large sturdy box made of pine boards darkened by age and by the smoke of countless fires. Its lid was heavy, fitted with iron hinges that moved smoothly despite their years, and its front was carved with a simple pattern of interlocking lines that wound around the edges in a continuous, unbroken band. The chest had been made by a hand that knew wood well, a hand that had belonged to someone now long gone, and it held within it the soft wealth of the household, the woolens, the linens, the spare cloth that had been woven on the loom, standing silent beside it. You lifted the lid with both hands, the weight of the wood familiar and reassuring, and you propped it open with the long, notched stick that was kept for that purpose. The scent that rose from the interior was clean and herbal, the smell of the juniper sprigs that were scattered among the fabrics to keep away moths and to lend their sharp, fresh fragrance to the cloth. You leaned over the chest and looked inside, your eyes moving over the neatly folded piles of wool and linen that filled it nearly to the brim. The fabrics were arranged by type and use, the heavier blankets and cloaks at the bottom, the lighter tunics and undergarments above, and the lengths of sailcloth and wadmal rolled tightly and placed along the sides. Everything was orderly and calm, a quiet store of warmth and comfort. You began to lift the items out, one by one, laying them on the bench beside the chest. The heavy wool cloaks came first, 2 of them, their fabric thick and tightly woven, dyed a deep brown with walnut husks and edged with tablet-woven bands of cream and black. The wool was slightly scratchy to the touch, but warm, the sort of warmth that held the heat of a body for hours and repelled the damp of a winter rain. You folded each cloak again, more compactly this time, bringing the edges together and smoothing the fabric with your palms, and you set them aside in a neat stack. Next came the spare linen tunics, 4 of them, their fabric a pale, creamy color that had softened with many washings until it was almost as supple as skin. The linen was cool to the touch, light and smooth, and you held one up to the grey light from the door, seeing the fine, even weave and the small, careful stitches that had repaired a tear near the hem. You folded the tunics with the same methodical care, tucking the sleeves inside and rolling them into tight, compact bundles that would fit easily into whatever container you chose for them. The wadmal cloth came after the tunics, a length of heavy, fulled wool that was thick and dense as felt, its surface slightly fuzzy and its color a soft, mottled grey. Wadmal was a practical fabric used for making cloaks and blankets, and even as a form of trade, and this piece was large enough to make 2 good winter blankets or to cut into strips for leggings and wraps. You rolled it tightly, tucking the ends under, and bound it with a strip of flax string to keep it from unrolling. The spare sailcloth was the last item, a folded square of heavy, oiled canvas that smelled faintly of the sea and of the linseed oil that had been worked into its fibers to make it waterproof. The sailcloth was strong and stiff, its weave so tight that it could hold the wind without tearing, and it was a valuable thing, useful for covering supplies or making a temporary shelter. You folded it once more, reducing its size until it was a compact, flat rectangle, and you set it on the pile with the other things. There were also smaller items at the bottom of the chest that you had almost forgotten. A pair of wool socks, thick and undyed, that had been knitted with care by someone in the household, and a length of fine linen thread wound around a wooden spool, and a small bundle of goose feathers meant for mending pillows. You gathered these too, tucking them into the folds of the tunics, and then you looked at the collection of textiles on the bench, a substantial pile of warmth and softness that would need a dry, secure hiding place. The hiding place you had in mind was a spot you had thought of earlier in the day, a damp, peaty hollow in the hillside, a short walk from the farm where you had long kept a sealed barrel for just such a purpose. The barrel had been placed there years ago, after a summer of particularly good fishing had left you with more barrels than you needed, and you had chosen the spot because it was cool and shaded, and because the peat would hold the barrel steady and keep it from shifting. You had not visited the barrel in some time, but you knew it was still there, waiting in the quiet of the hillside. You went out to the tool shed to fetch a length of rope and a small wooden mallet, and then you returned to the longhouse to gather the textiles. You made 2 trips to the sledge, which still stood near the grain shed, and you loaded the fabrics carefully, arranging them in a stable pile and covering them with a piece of old sailcloth to protect them from any damp on the walk. The sledge was lighter than it had been with the grain sacks or the hay, and you pulled it easily as you set out across the farmyard and up the gentle slope towards the hillside. The path to the peat hollow was not a proper track, just a faint line through the grass and heather that you had made by walking it a few times each year. The ground rose steadily, the grass giving way to a patch of low, scrubby bushes, and then to an open stretch of heather that was darker and shorter than the heather in the lower meadows, its stems wiry and its flowers a deep, bruised purple. The soil here was thinner, and rocks broke through the surface in grey, weathered humps, their surfaces crusted with pale lichen that crumbled under your boots. The air was cooler than it had been in the farmyard, and it carried a faint, earthy smell of peat and damp moss, a clean, dark scent that seemed to rise from the ground itself. The hollow came into view as a slight dip in the hillside, a shallow depression that was marked by a few stunted rowan trees and a thick growth of bog, myrtle, their leaves small and fragrant, releasing a sharp, resinous scent when you brushed against them. The ground underfoot grew softer as you approached, the heather giving way to a carpet of sphagnum moss that was bright green and red in patches and that held water like a sponge, releasing it with a soft, wet squelch when you stepped on it. The hollow itself was a quiet, sheltered place, its sides lined with peat banks that had been cut in previous years, the dark, fibrous layers of the peat exposed and glistening with moisture. The barrel sat at the bottom of the hollow, half buried in the peat and hidden by a screen of bog myrtle. It was a stout cask, larger than the brine barrel, made of oak staves bound with iron hoops, its wood dark and stained, but still sound. You had sealed it years ago with a tight-fitting lid, and when you knelt beside it and examined it, you saw that the lid was still in place, the wood slightly swollen with the damp but not rotted. You used the mallet to tap around the edges of the lid, loosening it gently, and then you lifted it off with both hands, setting it aside on the moss. The interior of the barrel was dry and surprisingly clean, smelling faintly of the pine resin that had been used to seal the staves. A few dried juniper sprigs lay at the bottom, left there from the last time you had used the barrel, and their scent was still faintly present, a sharp, clean note beneath the earthier smell of the wood. The barrel was empty and ready, a dry, dark chamber waiting to be filled, and you began to transfer the textiles from the sledge to the barrel, working slowly and carefully. You had brought a supply of dried moss with you, gathered from a patch near the farm where the ground was high and dry and the moss grew thick and clean. The moss was pale green and feathery, and it had been dried in the sun until it was crisp and springy. You laid a thick layer of it in the bottom of the barrel, a soft absorbent bed that would draw away any moisture that might find its way inside, and then you began to place the textiles on top. The wool cloaks went in first, their heavy folds settling onto the moss with a soft, muffled sound, and you arranged them so that they covered the entire bottom of the barrel, forming a protective layer for the things above. The linen tunics went next, their pale bundles light against the dark wool, and you placed them side by side, fitting them into the curve of the barrel. The wadmore roll went in beside them, and the sailcloth folded on top, and the small items, the socks, the thread, the feathers, were tucked into the gaps, filling every space so that nothing would shift. You placed another layer of dried moss on top of the textiles, spreading it evenly with your hands, and then you lifted the lid back onto the barrel. The lid was a tight fit, and you used the mallet to tap it down, working around the edge with gentle, even blows that drove the wood into place with a soft, hollow thumping. When the lid was seated, you checked the seal by running your finger around the join, feeling for any gaps, but the wood had swollen just enough to make the closure tight and secure. The barrel was now a sealed container, its contents protected from the damp and the air and the probing of any small animals that might wander through the hollow. The final task was to hide the barrel more completely, to blend it into the landscape so that it would not be seen by any casual eye. The peat banks around the hollow provided a natural source of camouflage, and you used your hands to scoop up sections of the dark, fibrous peat, lifting them carefully so that they held together in rough squares. You placed these squares of turf on top of the barrel and around its sides, fitting them together like tiles, their dark surface matching the surrounding ground. The peat was damp and heavy, and it smelled of the deep earth, a rich, ancient scent that was the essence of the hillside. You worked slowly, covering the barrel completely, and when you were finished, there was only a low, irregular mound where the barrel had been, a mound that looked like a natural feature of the hollow, no different from the other hummocks and rises that dotted the hillside. You stepped back and looked at the spot, your hands dark with peat and your tunic smudged with moss. The hollow was quiet and still, the bog myrtle rustling faintly in the light breeze that had begun to stir, and the rowan trees stood as silent guardians at its edges. The barrel was invisible, sealed and hidden, and the textiles within it would wait out the coming months in their dry, dark chamber, ready to be retrieved when they were needed. You felt the same quiet satisfaction you had felt at each of the other hiding places, a sense of something completed, something done with care and patience and a calm attention to detail. You gathered the mallet and the rope and the empty sledge, and you began the walk back down the hillside to the farm. The light had not changed, still that same pale, even grey that had covered the sky all day, but the air had a slight coolness to it now, a hint that the evening was not far away. You followed the faint path through the heather and the scrubby bushes, your boots leaving dark prints in the damp moss, and you let your mind rest in the simple rhythm of walking. The farm came into view below you, the longhouse and the barn, and the sheep shelter clustered together in their green yard, and the fjord lay beyond them, still in silver, a quiet presence that held the whole valley in its calm. You walked down the slope, the sledge light behind you, and you felt the deep, steady peace of a day that had been spent in careful, boring work. Each task a small act of preservation, each hiding place a quiet promise of safety and survival. The afternoon had grown long and still, the grey sky holding its pale light without change, and you stood in the farmyard with your hands resting on the top of a wooden rake, looking out at the path that led towards the alder wood. The main work of hiding was done. The grain lay under sailcloth and ferns in the hollow between the boulders. The dried fish and the brine barrel were tucked into the rock cleft and under the overhang by the shore. The tools were buried in their stone-lined trench behind the sheep shelter. The small, strong box of valuables rested in its pottery jar beneath the flat stone by the rowan tree. The haystack stood covered with bark and branches under the granite outcrop, and the textiles were sealed in their barrel beneath squares of teed, her side hollow. Each hiding place was complete, each one a quiet, careful act of preservation. Now there was one task left, a task that was slower and softer than all the others, and in its own way just as important, the work of covering traces, of returning the land to its original silence. You began at the boulder cache, walking the familiar track through the alders with the rake over your shoulder and a bundle of pine branches tied under your arm. The wood was as quiet as it had been in the morning, the trees standing in their patient grey-green ranks, their leaves barely stirring in the still air. The light under the canopy was a soft, filtered green, and the moss on the ground was springy under your boots, still damp from the morning mist. You walked slowly, your eyes on the path ahead, noting the marks you had left earlier, the two parallel grooves of the sledge runners cutting through the wet leaf mold, the deeper impressions of your own footprints, the occasional scuff where the sledge had bumped against a root or a stone. These marks were faint, already beginning to fade as the moisture in the ground seeped back and the disturbed moss slowly rose, but they were still visible to a careful eye, and you had come to erase them. You set down the bundle of branches and took up the rake, a simple tool with a long ash handle and a head made of birchwood, its teeth worn smooth and rounded. You began at the edge of the wood, where the path left the farmyard, and you worked the rake gently over the ground, drawing it across the sledge tracks with a light, even pressure that smoothed the mud and lifted the flattened moss. The rake made a soft, scratching sound, a whisper of wood against earth, and you moved it in long, sweeping strokes that blended the marks into the surrounding ground. You did not try to erase them completely because that would have been impossible, but you softened them, blurred their edges, made them look like the natural undulations of the forest floor rather than the deliberate marks of a sledge and a man. Where the tracks passed over exposed roots or rocks, you used the pine branches like a broom, brushing the surface with a gentle flicking motion that scattered loose needles and small pieces of bark over the disturbed areas. The pine needles were dry and brown, and they fell in a natural, random pattern, covering the scuffs and scratches with a layer of forest litter that looked as if it had been there for weeks. You worked slowly, moving from one mark to the next, and you paused often to look at your work, checking that the ground appeared undisturbed. The process was methodical and calm, a quiet rhythm of raking and brushing that matched the slow, even beating of your heart. When you reached the clearing with the boulders, you stopped and looked at the entrance to the hollow. The ferns you had pulled into place earlier were still there, forming their green curtain over the gap, but your footprints were visible in the soft moss around the clearing, and the sledge had left its tracks where you had turned it around. You used the rake to smooth the moss, lifting it gently with the teeth and letting it fall back into place, and you scattered handfuls of dry leaves and small twigs over the area, letting them fall where they would. You rearranged a few fronds of bracken, bending them slightly to cover a patch of flattened moss, and you removed a small stone that had been knocked out of place, setting it back into its natural depression. The work was delicate and patient, and by the time you were finished, the clearing looked exactly as it had when you first arrived in the morning, a quiet, hidden place with no sign of human passage. From the boulder cache, you walked back through the wood and down to the shore, carrying the rake and the pine branches with you. The tide had risen slightly, the water now lapping against the lower rocks with a soft, rhythmic sound, and the air smelled of salt and the clean, sharp scent of the bladderwrack. You made your way along the shingle to the rock cleft, your boots crunching on the pebbles, and you examined the ground around the hiding place. The marks here were different from the forest marks, your footprints in the sand and pebbles, the faint trail where you had rolled the brine barrel, the scattered seaweed that had been disturbed when you pulled it aside. The shingle was harder to disguise than the moss because the pebbles were loose and constantly shifting, and any mark you made would itself be a mark. You worked with the rake, drawing it across the pebbles in a pattern that mimicked the natural sorting of the tide. You pulled the stones into gentle, irregular ridges, the sort of lines that the waves left when they receded, and you smoothed the sand with the flat of the rake head, erasing your footprints one by one. The seaweed you rearranged with your hands, lifting the wet, heavy fronds and draping them over the rocks in a way that looked natural, their air bladders popping softly under your fingers. The brine barrel's trail was a deeper mark, a groove in the pebbles where the iron hoops had scraped, and you filled it in with smaller stones, working them into the groove until it was no longer visible. The work took time and you moved slowly along the shore, your attention focused on the small details, the color of the stones, the angle of the seaweed, the way the light fell on the water. At the overhang where the brine barrel and the dried seaweed were hidden, you performed the same careful concealment. The barrel was invisible under its drape of seaweed, but the ground in front of it showed the marks of your boots and the scrapes where you had wedged the stones around the base. You smoothed the sand with the rake and scattered a few handfuls of dry, crumbled seaweed over the area, the small dark fragments blending with the natural debris of the shore. The overhang itself cast a deep shadow, and the marks were hard to see in the dim light, but you covered them anyway because the work was not about necessity, but about thoroughness, about the quiet satisfaction of leaving no trace. From the shore, you climbed the slope to the sheepyard, where the tools were buried. The earth here had settled since you had filled the trench, and the mound had flattened out, blending into the surrounding ground. The straw you had scattered had mixed with the dirt, and the sheep had walked over the area, their hooves pressing their own marks into the soil and helping to disguise any sign of disturbance. You used the rake to break up a few remaining clods of earth, and you scattered more straw from the yard, tossing it lightly so that it fell in a natural, random layer. The sheep watched you from the shelter, their eyes calm and incurious, and one of them gave a soft, low bleat that sounded more like a sigh. You scratched her behind the ear as you passed, and then you walked on to the cow pasture. The flat stone by the rowan tree sat as it had always sat, grey and solid and unremarkable. The ground around it was smooth, the soil packed down and covered with a scattering of rowan leaves that you had placed there earlier. A few more leaves had fallen since then, drifting down from the branches in the still air, and they lay on the stone and on the grass in a pattern that looked entirely natural. You walked around the stone, examining it from all sides, and you saw nothing that suggested the earth had been disturbed. The cows had grazed nearby, their droppings dotting the grass in a few places, and you used the pine branch to flick some of the dry, fibrous dung away from the stone, a small, unnecessary touch that completed the picture. The rowan tree stood overhead, its leaves dark green, its berries beginning to show the first faint blush of orange, and it seemed to you that the tree was a good guardian, patient and still and deeply rooted in the earth. The meadow stack was the next place, and you walked the long path through the heather and past the marsh, the rake over your shoulder and the pine branches under your arm. The light had still not changed, the grey sky holding its pale, even tone, but the air had a slight coolness to it now, a hint that the evening was somewhere far off, but slowly approaching. The meadow was quiet, the outcrop dark against the sky, the birches shivering faintly in the breeze that had begun to stir. You walked around the haystack, checking the covering of bark and branches, and you saw that everything was secure. The ground around the stack was covered with a natural layer of old grass and scattered stones, and the few footprints you had left were already fading, the grass springing back into place. You used the pine branches to brush the area lightly, removing a few stems of hay that had fallen from the sledge, and you tucked a loose piece of bark back under its stone. The stack was invisible from any distance, hidden by the outcrop and the birches, and you left it with a quiet nod, a small acknowledgement of a task well done. The last hiding place was the peat hollow on the hillside, where the barrel of textiles lay under its squares of turf. You climbed the slope through the heather and the bog myrtle, your boots sinking into the damp moss, and you stood at the edge of the hollow, looking at the mound that covered the barrel. The peat squares had settled into place, their edges softening as they absorbed moisture from the air, and they now looked like a natural hummock, no different from the others that dotted the hillside. A few bog myrtle leaves had fallen onto the mound, and you left them there because they added to the natural appearance. You walked around the hollow, checking the ground for any sign of your earlier presence, and you found a few dark prints in the moss where you had knelt. You used your hands to lift the moss gently, fluffing it up with your fingers, and you scattered a handful of dry heather stems over the prints, letting them fall where they would. The hollow was quiet and still, the only sound the faint rustle of the myrtle leaves and the distant, low hum of a bee working the heather somewhere on the hillside. You stood for a while at the top of the hollow, looking out over the landscape. The farm lay below you, the longhouse and the barn and the shelters clustered together in their green yard, and the fjord stretched beyond, a long sheet of silver-grey water that held the reflection of the hills. The view was peaceful and familiar, a view you had seen 1,000 times, and it looked no different now than it had at the start of the day. There was no sign of the work you had done, no indication that the supplies of the farm had been quietly dispersed across the land and hidden in their secret places. The farm looked exactly as it always looked, a quiet Norse holding by a calm fjord, with no hint of anything out of the ordinary. You walked back down the hillside with the rake and the pine branches, your pace slow and steady, and you returned the tools to their places in the tool shed. The rake went on its peg, the pine branches went onto the pile of trimmings, and you washed your hands at the water bucket, scrubbing away the soil and the peat and the salt. The water was cool and clean, and you drank a cup slowly, feeling it soothe your throat and settle in your stomach. The day had been long and full of quiet work, and the evening was approaching, though the light had still not changed, that same pale grey brightness covering the world like a blanket. You stood by the longhouse door, looking out at the farm, and you felt the deep, calm satisfaction of a day spent in careful, boring labor. Each task a small act of preservation, each hiding place a quiet promise that the winter would be survived and the spring would come again. The last of the covering work was done. The rake and the pine branches returned to their places, the tool shed closed and quiet. You stood in the farmyard with your hands empty and the grey sky still holding its pale, even light overhead, though you sensed, in the slight coolness of the air and the way the shadows had begun to deepen almost imperceptibly under the eaves of the longhouse, that evening was drawing near. The day had been long and full of slow, careful tasks, each one folding into the next without hurry or strain, and now the farm lay around you in a state of calm completion, its hidden supplies tucked away in their secret places, its surface undisturbed and peaceful. You walked to the water bucket and washed your hands one last time, scrubbing away the faint traces of soil and peat and salt that still clung to your skin. The water was cool and clean, and you splashed a little on your face, feeling the freshness of it against your cheeks and your forehead, washing away the quiet tiredness that had settled there over the hours of walking and lifting and digging. You dried your face on the sleeve of your tunic, the wool rough and familiar, and then you pushed open the door of the longhouse and stepped inside. The interior was dim and warm, the fire in the hearth burning low but steady, its flames a deep quiet orange that cast soft, moving shadows on the curved turf walls. The smell of wood smoke and dried herbs, and the faint, clean scent of the wool blankets wrapped around you like a familiar garment, and you paused just inside the doorway, letting your eyes adjust and your breathing slow. The longhouse was empty, the household still about its own quiet tasks, somewhere on the farm, and you had the space to yourself, a calm, solitary refuge at the end of a long day. You crossed to the hearth and knelt down, taking up the iron poker that leaned against the stones. The embers glowed beneath their cap of grey ash, and you stirred them gently, coaxing the fire back to a brighter life. You added a few sticks of driftwood, their surfaces silvered and smooth from long tumbling in the fjord, and you watched as the flames curled around them, finding the dry fibers and licking upwards with a soft crackling sound. The driftwood burned with a pale, almost blue flame at first, and then it settled into the steady orange glow of the rest of the fire, adding its warmth to the room. You added a slightly larger piece, a section of pine branch that still had a few dried needles clinging to it, and the needles flared up briefly with a sharp, resinous scent before settling into the general blaze. With the fire burning steadily, you turned to the small store of food that you had kept aside in the longhouse, the portion you had not hidden. There was a flat, round loaf of barley bread, wrapped in a linen cloth, baked 2 days ago on the hearth stones, its crust dark and its interior dense and slightly chewy. There was a small piece of dried cod, the flesh pale and flaky, and the clay pot of soft cheese made from sheep's milk, its surface slightly crumbly and its taste mild and clean. You set these things out on the wooden board near the hearth, arranging them with the same quiet care you had given to every task that day, and you poured yourself a cup of water from the bucket, the water cool and tasting faintly of the peat it had filtered through. You sat down on the 3-legged stool near the fire, the same stool where you had sat in the morning with your bowl of porridge, and you began to eat your simple supper. You broke off a piece of the barley bread, the crust cracking under your fingers, and you chewed it slowly, tasting the nutty flavor of the grain and the faint saltiness from the hearthstones. You pulled a strip of the dried cod apart, the fibers separating in long, pale strands, and you ate it with small bites, the saltiness of the fish contrasting with the mild sweetness of the bread. The cheese you spread on a piece of bread with the back of a wooden spoon, and you ate it while watching the flames move and shift, their shapes endlessly changing and endlessly the same. The food was plain and satisfying, the sort of meal you had eaten 1,000 times, and you ate it without hurry, letting each bite rest on your tongue before you swallowed. The shadows in the longhouse grew deeper as you ate, the light from the fire becoming the only real brightness in the room. The corners near the loom and the storage chests were dark now, their shapes soft and indistinct, and the roof beams overhead were lost in a dim, smoky haze. The only sounds were the quiet crackle of the fire, the soft settling of the timbers as the evening coolness crept in, and the distant, rhythmic hush of the fjord against the shore, a sound so constant and so familiar that it was almost like silence itself. You finished your meal and set the wooden board aside, and you poured another cup of water, drinking it slowly while you let the warmth of the fire wash over you. You thought about the day, letting the memories of it drift through your mind in a slow, gentle procession. You remembered the grey mist of the early morning, the way it had clung to the water and the hills, and the thin line of distant smoke that had started everything. You remembered the grain sacks in their mossy hollow between the boulders, covered with sailcloth and screened by ferns, and you pictured them there, dry and safe in the quiet of the alderwood. You remembered the dried fish in the rock cleft, the brine barrel under the overhang, the tools in their stone-lined trench behind the sheep shelter, the small strong-box in its pottery jar beneath the flat stone by the rowan tree, the haystack under the granite outcrop, the textiles sealed in their barrel in the peat hollow. Each hiding place was a small, quiet achievement, a careful act of preservation that had occupied your hands and your mind for the whole of the long grey day. You felt no anxiety as you thought about these things, no worry about whether the hiding places would be discovered or whether the rumours of strange ships would come to anything. Those thoughts had no place in the calm of the evening, and you let them pass by like clouds drifting across the wide grey sky. What you felt instead was a deep, quiet satisfaction, the same feeling you had when a harvest was fully gathered, or a fence was mended, or a net was stowed away for the winter. It was the feeling of work done well, of things put in their proper places, of a day spent in slow, careful labour that had meaning and purpose, without any need for drama or haste. The fire had burned down a little, the driftwood reduced to glowing coals that pulsed with a soft orange light, and you added one more small piece, a chunk of birch that had been drying by the hearth for weeks. The bark caught quickly, flaring up with a bright, white flame that lit the whole longhouse for a moment, and then the flame settled into the steady, quiet burn that would last through the evening. You sat and watched the birch burn, the bark curling back on itself, and the wood beneath turning first golden and then black, and you let your mind rest in the simple, wordless presence of the fire. Outside, the light was finally beginning to change. Through the narrow gaps under the eaves, you could see that the grey of the sky had deepened to a softer, darker shade, a twilight grey that spoke of the sun sinking somewhere far beyond the clouds and the hills. The farmyard was growing dim, the grass losing its green and turning to a muted silvery colour, and the shapes of the barn and the sheep shelter were becoming indistinct, merging with the general shadow of the evening. A single bird called from somewhere near the alderwood, a few clear descending notes that repeated twice, and then fell silent, and the quiet that followed was deeper than before, a true evening quiet that seemed to hold its breath. You rose from the stool and walked to the door, pushing it open and stepping out into the yard. The air was cooler now, carrying the damp, clean scent of the coming night, and the fjord lay before you in the twilight, a sheet of dark silver that was barely distinguishable from the sky. The water was perfectly still, no wind to ruffle its surface, and it reflected the last of the grey light in a faint, pearlescent sheen that stretched from the shore to the far hills. The hills themselves were dark shapes now, their outlines soft and rounded against the slightly lighter sky, and a few faint stars were beginning to show through the thinning clouds, tiny points of light that glimmered and then steadied. You stood there for a while, your hands resting on the doorframe, and you let the peace of the evening settle over you, a peace that was as deep and as calm as the water before you. There was no sign of any raiders. No strange sails on the fjord, no distant smoke beyond the headland, no sound of oars or voices or anything that did not belong to the quiet rhythm of the farm. The world was as it had always been, a small sheltered holding by a calm stretch of water, surrounded by hills and forest, and the patient, enduring land. You looked out at the fjord for a long time, your eyes tracing the familiar line of the far shore, and you felt no fear and no unease. Only the quiet certainty that you had done what you could, and that the night would be peaceful. When the coolness of the air began to creep through the weave of your tunic, you turned and went back inside, closing the door behind you with a soft wooden thud. The longhouse was warm and welcoming, the fire still blowing on the hearth, and you crossed to your sleeping bench and sat down on the edge of it, your hands resting on your knees. You pulled off your boots, setting them side by side on the packed earth floor, and you peeled off your wool socks, feeling the cool air on your bare feet. The straw mattress rustled as you stretched out on the bench, and you pulled the wool blanket up over your legs and chest, the fabric warm and slightly scratchy against your chin. You lay on your back for a while, looking up at the dark underside of the turf roof, where the smoke from the fire gathered in a soft grey haze before drifting out through the smoke hole. The firelight flickered on the walls, casting moving patterns of light and shadow that were endlessly shifting and endlessly calm. The sounds of the longhouse settled around you, the soft crackle of the embers, the faint rustle of the blanket as you shifted, the distant rhythmic hush of the fjord against the shore that came through the walls like a lullaby. You let your breathing slow, feeling the rise and fall of your chest under the blanket, and you let your thoughts drift without direction, floating like the smoke up towards the dark roof and then dispersing into the quiet. You thought of nothing in particular, and you thought of everything at once. The grey mist of the morning, the weight of the grain sacks, the smell of the dried fish, the cool earth of the sheep-yard trench, the warm amber beads in their pottery jar, the sweet scent of the haystack, the dark peat of the hillside hollow, the pine branches sweeping over the tracks, the twilight settling over the tracks. The twilight settling over the tracks. The images came and went without urgency, each one a small, quiet part of a day that had been full of small, quiet parts, and you let them pass through your mind like the slow, steady current of the fjord moving beneath its still surface. Your eyes grew heavy, the lids sinking down until the firelight was just a soft orange glow behind your lashes, and your body felt heavy too, sinking into the straw mattress as if the bench were holding you with a gentle, patient strength. The sounds of the evening blended together into a single soothing hum, the fire and the water and the distant silent stars all part of the same deep quiet. You turned onto your side, pulling the blanket closer around your shoulders, and you let out a long, slow breath that seemed to carry the last of the day's wakefulness with it. The last thing you heard before sleep took you was the sound of the fjord, that endless gentle hush of water against stone, a sound that had been there before you were born and would be there long after, a sound that held the whole valley in its calm, steady rhythm. And you fell asleep exactly there, in the warm, dim longhouse by the quiet water, with the fire glowing low on the hearth and the hidden supplies resting in their secret places, and the night wrapped around the farm like a second blanket, soft and deep and perfectly still.